Aloha and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about dictionaries. Dictionaries are container objects with key value pairs. So a key is associated with a value, much like a word is associated with the explanations in a dictionary. So that's how it got its name. You're basically looking up something based on a key, a word. So dictionary elements, one thing to keep in mind about them, until recently, they were different from lists in that lists maintain their insertion order. So when you're inserting things into a list, new items go on to the end of it. Whereas with a dictionary, that relationship really wasn't standardized. So it didn't always return necessarily in the order that you put it in. Sometimes it would, sometimes it wouldn't. It had to do with the hashing that goes on in the background. So it couldn't be really reliable. But from Python 3.7 on, they have made it so that dictionaries maintain their insertion order. So that is something that I really don't want you to rely on. And the reason I don't want you to rely on that is because sometimes you'll find people, if you're writing code that other people are going to run on other systems, they need to make sure that they have Python 3.7 or above, or they may experience strange errors. It may not break, flat out, but it will have the characteristic that at certain times it may not act as expected, and that can be really hard to track down. So be very careful about things like that. If you do write code that's going to it's going to rely on the insertion order being maintained, you'll really need to put that in comments somewhere to let the person that runs this in the future know that it must be version 3.7 or greater that runs it, because people do run older versions. So keep that in mind. So without further ado, let's open up VS Code and go through some examples that I have. So let's pull up here. Alrighty. So there we go. So let's talk about creating dictionaries. So the first thing that we have here is really rather simple. We're going to create an empty dictionary, and we're going to do it using what I call squiggly brackets, which gets a lot of laughs. Curly braces, curly brackets. There's lots of different names for it. I just call it squiggly brackets, and don't talk to me about that. So anyway, if you do this, let me clear out the screen down here, and we hit play, and we're going to get empty brackets, which is expected because we've created essentially nothing. So there's another method of creating things here called a dictionary comprehension. Dictionary comprehensions are similar to list comprehensions that we learned about before with lists, but we're not going to go into that here. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to be talking about. We do have something called a dict built-in function, and that is what we can use to create, we can actually create dictionaries. I don't like using this so much. I'd rather just use something like mydict and fill it in there. But you can say something like mydict equals dict and give it key word or key value pairs. So your keys like John, Billy, and Erica, they're going to be treated as strings, even though we don't put them in strings. And then we say equals, and then whatever comes after it. You can put strings here, you can put floating points, you can put whatever you want. So if we, let's comment this out for a second and run that, and you'll see that indeed we get, down here, we get John, it's treated as a string, Billy is a string, Eric is a string, but 27, 25, and 22.0, it's looking at it and saying, hey, that's an integer, that's an integer, that's a float. So if you wanted to do something like change this into a, let's say you want to change it into a string, you can do that as well. So you just go hit play, and you're going to get it treated as a string, and the others are treated as numbers still. So I don't want it as a string, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And then the last method we're going to talk about here is feeding it a list of tuples. So the tuples, we've got a pair of two items here. The first one is going to be the key. The second one is going to be the value. So we send a list of these tuples there, and that will fill in the dictionary with key value pairs, key value, key value. So if we do that, we will see that that comes up with essentially the same thing that this one did up here, except I changed 23. So if I left that as 22.0, we should get the same things there. Yep, So they're all the same. These are equivalent, basically. So something to keep in mind, we don't generally use this method. We usually do something like this. If you're doing a small dictionary of, let's say, default values, you might do something like this. But often we'll use an empty dictionary like this, and then we'll read in our values from, let's say, the input or from files. Another thing to keep in mind, dictionaries like lists are immutable objects. That means they can be, they do in-place modification. So when you run a method on it, it's actually modifying it in place. You don't have to assign it to itself or another variable to get that. It's not making a copy of it. It's actually changing the item itself, making that change in place. So the add, modify, and removals are happening in place. So now we're going to talk about different methods here, or different ways of doing things. We have, if you want to get a value, you can do something like this. You can say the dictionary name, then use brackets, and then put the key. And the key is going to basically grab whatever is in there. So this should pull up 22. So if we click on this, we see that indeed it pulled up 22. If you ask for something that's not in there, let's say Kevin, we don't have Kevin in there. So what's going to give us? It's going to give us a key error. So a key error if you ask for somebody that's not in there. So we're going to change that back to Erica. So we'll get that nice 22.0. So the next thing we're going to talk about is modifying entries. So we can modify entries that are out there. So if we wanted to change Erica to a 25, let's say, or let's say we want to change it to 55, just leave that as is. We go here and we now changed it to 55, and that's nice. But let's say we have somebody that's not in there. If we change that to Kevin, we're no longer modifying somebody, we're adding somebody, and that's going to be an addition at the end of the list. So when we hit that, sure enough, Kevin comes here at the end of the list, because from Python 3.7 on, insertion order matters. Kevin goes to the back of the line. So if we don't like Kevin, we can always get rid of Kevin. So we'd come in here, we'd uncomment this, we'd say delete. Notice this isn't a method, this is just the delete built-in function, delete my dict of Kevin, and then we hit the play, and bye-bye Kevin, you're gone. So he's out of there. And the last thing that we're going to check is inclusion. So we can check to see if an item is or is not in your dictionary, and it's going to be checking against the key. So if I do play here, Joe is not in our list, so we should get a false here. And indeed we did. If we ask for something that is in there, like John, and we hit play, we should get a true. And that's exactly what we get here. So we can look for things that are in or not in our, so we can also use the John not in, that should return false. And think, sure enough, it comes back false. So those are some things we can do. Another thing to keep in mind, dictionaries are kind of like a list in that each of the elements in a dictionary, or each of the values of a dictionary, can actually be in a list or a dictionary itself. So I've got an example here where we're just going to go ahead and we're going to come up with gradebook as a dictionary. And for each person, we're going to put in a list that contains all their grades. So when we print it, doesn't look that spectacular, but this is what it comes out to. So you can print, or you can store lists for that. You can actually put in, if you wanted to, a dictionary. Let's say this was going to be math. You could put in something like, you could put in a key that says math, and then this could be a list here. So it would point to a list. But note that now you have a value or a key in a dictionary pointing to a value of a dictionary, which is, the key with a list, which is a set of grades here. So you can make these things complex in all kinds of ways. So it's really up to you and what kind of information you're storing. You'll find a need for this eventually. I've used a lot of these types of things where I would have a person's information, so I would save it in a larger dictionary. I'd save it per person, and then I'd have their settings in there So you could set up their settings for different applications or whatever. So this is one way we do something like that. So anyhow, this is our intro to dictionaries. If you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to me. Send me an email. If you'd like to discuss it in depth, you can send me an email and say, hey, let's get together and do a Zoom meet. And I'd be happy to meet up with you and explain this in greater detail. So if you have any questions, get in touch. If not, I'll see you in the next lesson.